G'day, this is Chris Savage from Ariel Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the life of the Messiah from a Jewish perspective. I pray that it will be of a blessing to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Last session, we saw Messiah's authority over the Sabbath. Remember, the Sabbath was highly personified by the Jews, still is. They regard the Sabbath as the bride of Israel or God's queen, and they'd open up the doors on the Sabbath day and they'd sing a song welcoming Queen Sabbath into their synagogue. Rabbinic Judaism believed that Israel was made for the Sabbath. Moses commanded to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, and we see through the oral traditions that the rabbis made up. They now added 1,500 other rules and regulations to the Mosaic Law regarding Sabbath. We saw that there were 3 Sabbath controversies with the Pharisees and Jesus. Jesus healed a paralytic. He was guilty of reaping grain, and he's also healed a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath. The paralytic, he was 38 years in that condition. Jesus healed him without him even knowing who Jesus was. Jesus simply sought him out. He says, "You want to be healed?" And he healed him. And what we see there is that the Pharisees got upset. Why? Because the man was carrying his cot, the cot that he had been lying on for many years. He was carrying it under his arm back to his home, and that is one of those 1,500 rules that was broken on that day. You can't carry a load from the public place to a private place, or vice versa. So they got upset with Jesus when they found out that it was he who healed the man. Remember, they weren't particularly impressed by a paralytic who was healed after 38 years, but they were more focused upon carrying the bed. And so they got upset with Jesus. They were very upset with Jesus because he healed on the Sabbath. Now, Jesus' defense against their accusations, basically, he said, listen, he says, I and the Father, we're one, meaning he was equal with God. And he said, if you don't believe me, here are 4 witnesses who will testify to who I am. And he gave him 4 witnesses. John the Baptist, who declared that, behold, the Lamb of God. Also, he says, have a look at my miracles, the things that I do, like healing a man who was paralytic for 38 years. Also, we had the Father's voice out of heaven at his baptism, saying, this is my beloved Son. And also he said, check the scriptures out. Have a look into the scriptures, and you will see from the scriptures that I am the Messiah. Then we had another Sabbath. He and his disciples were guilty of reaping, threshing, winnowing, and storing grain on the Sabbath, because they were walking through a wheat field and they got some in their hands, they rubbed it together, and they started eating the grain. So that broke 4 more of the rabbinic Sabbath laws: reaping, winnowing, threshing, winnowing, and storing. Jesus' response to that was, he says, listen, he says, I am actually Lord of the Sabbath, and I'm greater than the temple. So virtually saying, listen, I can make rules. I can undo your rules, because your rules are not God's rules, they're simply your rules. The 3rd Sabbath controversy was with the man with a withered hand, which was a setup to try and trap Jesus. Jesus heals him nonetheless. And what this did was, this absolutely enraged the Pharisees, so much so that they're now taking counsel with the Herodians, their arch enemies, how they're going to destroy Jesus. And we also saw last session that Jesus, after an all-night prayer session, he chooses 12 disciples who will now be with him 24/7. Okay, so here today we are in, oh no, I've had my PowerPoint is, back up. Whew. Okay, we're now looking at Messiah's authority to interpret the law And we're going to see this in chapters 5:1 of Matthew, chapter 5:1 to chapter 8, verse 1, and also in Luke chapter 6, verses 17 to 49. And this section here is generally called the Sermon on the Mount. This just basically gives us the title of where Jesus conducted this sermon. It was simply on top of a mountain. It was a flat area on top of the mountain where all the disciples and all the gathering could sit down. It just tells us he was up there when he spoke these words, tells us nothing about the subject material that he used or anything. A better title for this section would be Messiah's authority to interpret the Mosaic Law. And the content being, it's a correct interpretation of the Mosaic Law. That's what Jesus is going to do with this Sermon on the Mount. Before we do that, though, just a bit of intro here for two areas. First of all, the background of the book, and secondly, the answer to the question of what is the Sermon on the Mount as a unit. Firstly, the historical background that leads up to this Sermon on the Mount. By this time, as we've just seen in the preceding paragraphs, there's a lot of interest in the messianic claims of Jesus and what he's saying and what he's doing, both inside and outside the borders of the land, because we saw even right up to Tyre and Sidon, just outside the land. So it's about, there's a lot of interest being shown now, and so they need to just get some clarification here. This is a period in history that the Jewish people were looking forward to, because they were looking for the Messiah to come, Messianic redemption, and they were looking for the establishment of the Messianic Kingdom on earth. And this was all from the prophets. Now, from what those prophets had said concerning the kingdom, the people understood that righteousness was the way into the kingdom. That was the means of entry. Now, what happened over these preceding 4 centuries, the Pharisees, which is the 4 centuries from the last book Malachi to this book Matthew, what we see over the last 4 centuries, the Pharisees had grown in their influence, and they had developed a form of righteousness which was a very, very wide road. It was so wide that they taught that all Israel would share in the age to come. And when it speaks about the age to come, it means the Messianic age or the Messianic Kingdom age. So what they basically said was that anyone who was born a Jew would automatically make it into the kingdom. However, only those who were faithful to the Mosaic Law, which is the law we're talking about here, the Mosaic Law, would have positions of authority or honor in the kingdom. But every Jew would be in the kingdom, irrespective. You simply had to be born a Jew and you were automatically in. That was the way that the Pharisees developed their righteousness. So the Pharisees, what they did was they offered a very, very wide road. It was they offered men a way of righteousness and a way into the kingdom. But it was an easy way in, and the gate was wide. Remember, Jesus says, he says the way is narrow, but the Pharisee says, no, the way is very wide. You simply have to be born a Jew. Jesus comes along, and he has been challenging that very foundation. And he is proclaiming a very narrow way of righteousness. He's teaching that one must experience a new birth. Now, the means of the new birth was by accepting him as the Messianic King to qualify for the kingdom. So because of these conflicts between the wide road of way of the Pharisees and the narrow road of Jesus, these conflicts have been going on for quite a while. There now is a question raised in the rank and file, if you like, the common people, and that is Pharisaic righteousness sufficient to make it into the kingdom? And if it's not sufficient, well, what righteousness is necessary? In comes Jesus. Now, that's the background to what we're going to see here. And the key verse in this section we see will be Matthew chapter 5, verse 20. Because in Matthew 5, verse 20, Jesus says, "For I say unto you, that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no wise enter into the kingdom of heaven." Now, we need to be careful here, because Jesus here is dealing with the attainment of righteousness by works that the Mosaic Law demands. Jesus and Israel, remember, are still under the Mosaic covenant, still under the Mosaic Law at this point in time, and they will be under the Mosaic Law, under the Mosaic covenant, until his death on the cross. The new covenant, which was promised by Jeremiah in Jeremiah 31 to 37, is not yet in effect. And the Sermon on the Mount does not deal with the new covenant. The purpose of the Sermon on the Mount is to show the correct interpretation of the Mosaic Law in contrast with the Pharisaic interpretation of the Mosaic Law. That's the background. Remember, Pharisees said, "Very wide road, entrance is for every Jew." Jesus says, "No, very narrow road, and it only comes through me." So with this statement in Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, Jesus repudiates Pharisaic Judaism on two counts. First of all, he said that the teaching of the scribes and the Pharisees did not offer sufficient righteousness for entering the kingdom. And secondly, he rejects Pharisaism in that they misinterpreted the true righteousness of the Mosaic Law. So it's two counts here. He rejects Pharisaism. Their teaching did not offer sufficient righteousness for entering the kingdom, and they also misinterpreted the true righteousness of the Mosaic Law. Remember, it has to do with all their other laws that they made up. Now, the second theme in the introduction here is, well, exactly what is the Sermon on the Mount? And it's a unit. The Sermon on the Mount is a unit. It's Jesus teaching a block of scriptures regarding the true righteousness of the Mosaic Law. So what is it as a package? I'll tell you what it's not first. There are three things it is not. First of all, it is not the constitution of the future Messianic Kingdom. That cannot be, because if it were, then we'd be required to keep all 613 commandments of the Mosaic Law. For this, where we are in this session, is the Sermon on the Mount. That's where Mosaic Law is. So it would mean a total reinstitution of the Mosaic Law, which can't happen because the law has been rendered inoperative when Messiah died. It's inoperative. It came to an end. Secondly, it is not a way of salvation. And what we see is that the more liberal circles in Christendom say that if you keep the high standards of the Sermon on the Mount, and in particular the golden rule, you will make it to heaven. That's a very wide road as well. And this is the alternate teaching for those who refuse to take the narrow road of placing one's faith in the Messiah. Now, even if somebody could keep these rules perfectly, you still wouldn't make it to heaven. Why? Because that would make salvation by works and not by grace through faith. So this sermon is a rule of life for those already saved. It is not a means of earning salvation. The third thing is it is not Christian or church ethics for this age. As a package, as a unit, the intent is not to serve as church ethics for this age. Now, Jesus does say things in the Sermon on the Mount that are repeated later on in the Gospels or in the epistles, and whatever was repeated by the apostles does become church ethics for this age. Because remember, the new law system, the law of Messiah, is based upon the doctrines of the apostles and the prophets, with Jesus Christ being the cornerstone. So, as a unit or as a package, the Sermon on the Mount is not intended to be church ethics for this age. It is dealing, what it's doing is it's actually dealing with the shortfalls in Pharisaic Judaism and what God's intention was for the Mosaic Law. Again, if church ethics was its purpose, then we would now be obligated to keep all 613 commandments of the Mosaic Law. Now, in Matthew 5, verse 19, Jesus says there, he says that a person may not break even one of these least commandments. What commandments is he talking about? The commandments of the Mosaic Law. So if this were church ethics today, what would that mean for us? No more ham sandwiches, because we'd be breaking the dietary codes. No eating of pork. No more bacon and eggs in the morning. No more clothing, no more polycotton dresses or shirts. Can't have mixed threads. So under the law, can't have mixed threads. Now, if you're a man and you got up in the morning and you shaved this morning, you've broken the Sermon on the Mount. You couldn't shave. Or if you did have a beard and you actually you rounded the edges, you've broken the Sermon on the Mount. Can't be rounded corners. Have to be corner, straight, not round the mount. So what we see here is that these are three things the Sermon on the Mount is not. It is not the constitution of the Messianic Kingdom. It is not a way of salvation, and it is certainly not church ethics for the church age. So what is it? As a unit, it is the Messiah's interpretation of the true righteousness of the law in opposition to how the Pharisees interpreted the law. Pharisees believed the Mosaic Law required external conformity only. So the purpose of the Sermon on the Mount is to clearly set out the righteousness of God as demanded by the Mosaic Law, which required more than simply external conformity. It required both internal and external conformity. Remember, Mosaic Law ended not with the coming of the Messiah, but with the death of the Messiah. As long as Jesus was alive, all 613 laws of Moses had to be kept. Now, what's the occasion for the Sermon on the Mount? We see this in Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 to 2, and Luke chapter 6, 17 to 19. In Matthew 5, 1, we see that Jesus went up into the mountain and sat down. Straight away, you see he's going to sit down to teach, because that's a rabbi sits down to teach. Jewish Roman reference. Now, this sermon was given on a mountain, but Luke simply points out in 6 verse 17 that it was a level place. So it's a bit of a plateau at the top of the mountain where a lot of people could sit around. Matthew now only mentions the presence of the disciples, but Luke says in verse 17 that these are not just local people. He says, but from all Judea and Jerusalem and the sea coast of Tyre and Sidon. So these weren't just the local guys from around the Sea of Galilee. People have come from everywhere. Now, what did they come for? Dr. Luke tells us in Luke 6, 17 to 18, to hear him teach, to be healed of their diseases, and to be freed from demons. That's why they came. His reputation has spread far and wide. Now, Jesus healed all who came to him, but that was not his primary focus. His primary focus was what he wanted to teach his disciples. And by the time this message was given, three things had taken place. First of all, a great deal of interest had been stirred up in and out of the land. Second, he and the Pharisees had already gotten into a conflict over the authority of the Mishnah. And third, it came after he had now closed the apostolic group of 12. Remember, when I speak about the Mishnah, I'm speaking about the oral laws that they made up, or the traditions of the elders. Not God-given laws, man-made laws that the Pharisees made up. Now, the characteristics of true righteousness and of those who attain it. And we see this in Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 to 12, and Luke chapter 6, 20 to 23. This is the section you'd all know as the Beatitudes, the Beatitudes. Now, each verse in this section begins with the word blessed. And the word blessed actually means happy in the Greek. Happy are those who get this, or happy are those who attain that. Happy are those who develop the characteristics described here by Jesus. The term blessed refers to one who is the object of grace and is happy because of it, irrespective. So those who are blessed do not face an easy life. In fact, we're going to see here, Jesus mentions poverty and deprivation. So it reflects the reality that many early Christians were actually poor. And in addition, their commitment to Jesus also led to their being persecuted like the prophets of old. So when you read these two passages, Matthew chapter 5, verse 3 to 12, and Luke 6, 20 to 23, side by side, you will notice that Matthew mentioned the presence of disciples, so he puts the Beatitudes in the third person. Blessed are they, for they shall be, except for the very last one. And Luke mentioned a host of others, so he specified that Jesus addressed his disciples. And we see this in verses 9 to 20 of Luke 6. And Luke says Jesus put all the Beatitudes in the second person. Blessed are you, talking to his disciples. Blessed are you because of you. Now, there are two categories in these Beatitudes. First are those with their relationship to God, and then which we see in chapter 5 of Matthew 3 to 6 and Luke 6, 20 to 21. And then there are those in relationship to man. We see that in Matthew 5, 7 to 12 and Luke 6, 22 to 23. Now, first one, in relation to God. We see this in Matthew 5, 3 to 6. We have those with their relationship to God, and there are four of them. First of all, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. What does it mean to be poor in spirit? Financially? No. To be poor in spirit is the opposite of being prideful. It means to have a right and proper evaluation of oneself with respect to God. God's holy, I'm not. It's to recognize that man has no righteousness of his own, so man is totally dependent on the righteousness of God for mercy and salvation. So these are the ones who will enter the Messianic Kingdom. And in Matthew 5, verse 4, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Is this to be mourning because, you've lost a loved one or you've stubbed your toe? No, to mourn in this context means to develop a sensitivity to sin so that immediately a person sins, they're moved to confess their sin when they become aware of it, and then they are comforted because they've got forgiveness. So it is mourning in relationship to sin. And we can pick this up from Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 to 3. In fact, most of these Beatitudes, Isaiah 61, 1 to 3, has a lot of it in there. Now, Luke's version states, blessed are ye that weep now, for you shall laugh. What does that mean? It means that they will experience the joy and happiness of the forgiveness of sin. That's why you're going to be happy. Blessed, happy are you that mourn, because you recognize your sin, you confess it, and you know you're forgiven. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth or the land. To be meek means to have a quiet confidence in God. And that is in recognition of and in submission to his authority. We know God's in control. And those who have this quality and live a life of submission to God's authority will someday be given authority in the Messianic Kingdom. And you can see that in Psalm 37, verse 11. Then we have, blessed are they that hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Righteousness, what does that mean? It means to live in accordance with an absolute standard. And the standard we're talking about here in this Sermon on the Mount was the Mosaic Law. That was God's standard for how man should live. So blessed, happy are those who live consistently with the absolute standard of the Mosaic Law, for they shall have their righteousness. So these are the four characteristics of one who has attained true righteousness in relationship to God. Now, in relationship to man, this is verses 7 to 12 of Matthew 5. He lists 5. Verse 7, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. To be merciful means to be compassionate, to respond to the needs and seek to meet the needs of others. Those who are compassionate to others will receive compassion themselves as they need it. Blessed or happy are the poor in heart, pure in heart, for they shall see God. This means to operate out of a proper motive to be pleasing to God. The action towards others as they were in the previous beatitude are to come from a proper motive. So these are to be honest dealings, and so the motive for deeds of mercy is to be pleasing to the Lord. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. This is not peacemaking among the nations, but it is to be peace among fellow believers. And the goal here is to bring about a state of unity among the brethren. So happy are they. Blessed are they that have been persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, earlier on, Jesus spoke of righteousness in connection with God. He's now speaking of righteousness in connection with men. It means living consistently with the standard of the law of Moses and results in loving the neighbor as oneself, even if it brings on persecution. Up until now, everything is directly related to the Mosaic Law alone. All those 10 that we've done so far. But in this last point in verse 11, Jesus now adds one further step in light of the Messiah's coming. And this is Matthew 5, 11 to 12. Blessed are you when men shall reproach you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. So with the coming of the Messiah, anyone who wants to attain the righteousness which leads to the kingdom must believe Jesus is the Messianic King. Salvation is then granted to those who own him as such, and this will lead to persecution. However, it will also mean greater reward in the kingdom. Now, what's the characteristics of those who fail to attain this standard of righteousness? And this is the standard the Mosaic Law demanded. They are characterized as seeking four things. And for that, there are woes, W-O-E-S, pronounced upon them. Woes or cursings being the opposite of the previous blessings. Now, in Luke, this is in Luke chapter 6, 24 to 26. In Luke chapter 6, 24, woe unto you that are rich. So first up, they're seeking wealth. They're seeking materialism. That's their focus. Secondly, in 25, they're seeking self-satisfaction. Woe unto you that are full now, or those that are self-satisfied. I'm happy with my life as it is. I don't need God. Only those who are seeking to meet their own needs and not the needs of others. It's all about me. And then the third woe unto you that laugh now. And this is for those who are merely seeking merriment, party time. And then number 4 is reputation. Woe unto you when all men shall speak well of you. They're seeking a reputation. So these are those who fail to attain the righteousness demanded by the Mosaic Law. Put all these things together and contrast them with the characteristics of those who have attained The Pharisees are those who did not recognize their spiritual depravity or their spiritual needs. They saw no need for righteousness beyond their own, and they had no need of repentance. Remember when they went to John the Baptist baptism? They said, "We got Abraham for our father. We don't need your baptism." They demanded submission to their authority, and they withheld mercy from those who needed it, such as the publicans. And also, they were concerned only with the external demands of the law. And what did they do? They caused disunity or discord among the Jews. They're not peacemakers. Also, because they're in authority, they were also guilty of being persecutors, especially of those who chose to believe in Messiah Jesus. Now, in relationship to the world, we see this in Matthew 5, verses 13 to 16. Verse 13, you are the salt of the earth. Salt, what's salt? This is in relation to the world. Those who attain these characteristics of righteousness in relation to the world become two things. First of all, they become salt. You are the salt of the earth. Now, salt in ancient days was used, well, even today, it's still used for two purposes. It's used as a preservative and as a seasoning. So those who attain the righteousness of the law become both those things. First, they act as a preservative. Well, what are they preserving? A very common teaching of the Jewish prophets like Isaiah, and we see in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 9. Isaiah 1:9 says, except Jehovah of hosts had left unto us a very small remnant, we should have been as Sodom, we should have been like unto Gomorrah. So the prophets taught that the reason God did not destroy all Israel because of her sins was because there was always a believing remnant existing in the nation. And the existence of the remnant in Israel meant the survival of the nation. And so today, in Israel today, the Messianic Jews make up that believing remnant within that nation, and they are the preserving force, the preservative, the salt, and that is what is keeping the nation alive. And this can be a small group, such as back in Elijah's day. Elijah thought he was the only one. He says, God says, no, I've got 7,000 of us. So that was the believing remnant in Elijah's day. But if the salt has lost its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is then good for nothing but to be cast out and trodden under the foot of men. Now, just like Gentile followers of the Messiah, they also fulfill the seasoning aspect of the salt, because they are the ones who make life in this world worth living through encouragement, blessing, and mercy. The fellowship of believers, the koinonia, provides a refuge from the world. Now, salt also creates thirst, and as believers associate with the world, right, they should create a spiritual thirst that will draw unbelievers to the Messiah. Salt that no longer functions according to its purpose is useless and needs to be thrown out. Now, let's listen here. No details are given here in regard to a possible penalty. What the point Jesus is making here is more about a warning rather than giving specific consequences. Disciples who care about following Messiah would want to risk being considered, would not want to risk being considered useless by him. So this passage encourages the believer to respond positively to Messiah's calling. In Matthew 5, verses 13 to 16, the second thing that they attain in relation to the world is in verse 14. You are the light of the world. Jesus declares that it is those who have the truth who can provide spiritual light for those who are in spiritual darkness. Since we are the light of the world, the admonition is in verse 16. Even so, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father, which is in heaven. So the light of verse 14 is the good works of verse 16. Good work. Now, remember, good works do not save anyone. It's always faith by grace. But works are evidence of salvation. They're not the means of salvation. So when unbelievers see their works and they respond to the light generated by those works, they will come to the light and they'll become believers and glorify the Father who is in heaven. So let your light shine before men. Now in Matthew 5, verses 17 to 20, Jesus now gives us his purpose in regard to Mosaic law. In verse 17, think not that I came to destroy the law or the prophets, but to fulfill. Now this verse is often used to claim that the Mosaic law is still in effect, and all the passages in the epistles that teach that it's ended with Messiah's death are completely ignored. Jesus was living under the Mosaic law with all of its 613 commandments. It was still in effect and would continue right up until his death. The law did not end with his coming, but it ended with his death. His death terminates the rule of the Mosaic law, and until he died, all 613 commandments were obligatory, had to be obeyed. Now, in the context of his conflict with Judaism of his day, which is when the sermon is given, the point he's making here is that while the Pharisees have essentially destroyed the law by its many additions, which was all the reinterpretations and the changes of the law that they made in their oral traditions in the Mishnah, that was not Jesus's purpose. His purpose was to come and to fulfill the law as it is written, right? Not as it was reinterpreted to make it convenient. And those who use Matthew 5:17 to teach that the law is still in effect are never consistent, because they also teach that the vast majority of the 613 commandments are not applicable. However, Jesus will be the only Jew that ever lived that would keep the law perfectly in the 613 commandments applicable to him. Remember that only the Mosaic law was written at this time. The Mishnah, oral law, wasn't written down, or the traditions of the elders wasn't written down until 220 AD. Now, Jesus declared his intent to fulfill all the commands of the law in verse 18. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass away from the law, till all things be accomplished. So Jesus says here that nothing in the law can pass away until every jot and tittle is fulfilled. Now, what does that actually mean? There are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and the 10th letter is the letter Yod. In the English, it is jot. All the other 21 letters of the alphabet are the same size except for Yod, which is that little one. It's about a quarter of the size of the other letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So this means that Jesus intends to fulfill the law down to the very smallest letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Now, the tittle or stroke in Hebrew, it's called tag, refers to a small part of a single letter. And there are certain letters in the Hebrew alphabet that look very much alike, except for one small distinction. And see here we have the Hebrew letters Beth and the letter Kaf. The only difference between these two letters is a little bit sticking out. That's the tag or the tittle. So the same is true with the Dalet, the letter Resh. The only difference there is this little protrusion sticking out in the Dalet, and again, that's the tittle. So when Jesus says that he will fulfill the law down to the very jot and tittle of the law, he's saying that he will fulfill it to the smallest letter of the Hebrew alphabet and the smallest portion of a single letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So the jot and tittle are like crossing the T's and dotting the I's in English. Now, the fact that he mentioned the specific parts of the Hebrew alphabet directs the focus on which law? On the written law, not on the oral law. With his death, he took upon himself the curse of the law, died a penal substitutionary death, and rendered the law inoperative. Now, Jesus goes on to say in verse 19, whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men, so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So long as the Mosaic law is in effect, everything has to be kept. Notice he says the least of one of these commandments. What commandments is he talking about? The commandments of the written Mosaic law. That's the context of the passage. So as long as the Mosaic law is intact, it must be kept. Even the most insignificant of the 613 commandments must be kept. And then in verse 20, he makes a repudiating statement. Unless your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no wise enter into the kingdom of heaven. Is this in the next one? Ah, yes, sorry. Apologies. I thought I know another slide with this. Okay, so Jesus is, so unless, verse 20, unless your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no wise enter into the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus is saying here that the righteousness of the Pharisees is not the internal righteousness that God requires. He rejected Pharisaism on 2 counts, declaring that it did not offer sufficient righteousness for entering the Messianic Kingdom, and that it misinterpreted the true righteousness of the Mosaic Law. And this is the introduction now to the next examples we're going to look at. We have some examples here of the code of true righteousness, and we see this in Matthew 5:21 to 48. Jesus now picks out certain examples and contrasts them with the Pharisaic interpretation. Now, we're going to see here that in this section, there's certain verses there, beginning in this section. For instance, verse 21, you have heard that it was said. Verse 27, you have heard that it was said. Verse 31, it was said also. Verse 33, again, you've heard that it was said. Verse 38, you have heard that it was said. Verse 43, you've heard that it was said. It was said, it was said. Not written, it was said. And this formula copied the common rabbinic phrase, we have heard it said. What did that mean? It meant that the rules and regulations were received by oral traditions. It wasn't written down. And every time we read of Jesus using these words, it means that he is speaking about the oral law, right? The traditions of the elders, the Mishnah. Now, whenever the issue is a Mosaic commandment, you'll see it stated like this. It is written. If the issue is a written law, the formula is, it is written. Mosaic law, oral law, it was said. You've heard it said. Why? Because it's something that they heard, not something that was written. So it's oral. Now, what Jesus is going to do is he's going to choose a Mosaic commandment of the written law, and then he makes a contrast with the Pharisaic interpretation of the commandment through their oral law. And all the while, he's focusing on the righteousness of Mosaic law. Righteousness not only required external conformity, but also internal conformity. It was not only concerned with the act, but also with the intent of the heart, the spirit of the law, as well as the letter of the law. And Jesus now contrasts what the Pharisaic interpretation of the law with God's intent. How they interpreted it and what God actually means. Law of murder. First example, we see in chapter 5, verse 21 to 26 of Matthew. You shall not kill. Now, what that means is premeditated murder. In the Pharisaic interpretation of the righteousness of the commandment, they would say, you're not guilty of violating the righteousness of this commandment until you actually commit the act of murder. But the Messiah says that's the wrong interpretation. True, you don't violate the letter of the law until you actually commit the act. You can't be executed or punished by the law until you physically done the act. But here we're dealing with the righteousness of the law or command. And the righteousness is broken even before the physical act is committed. The point Jesus makes is that before anyone commits the act of premeditated murder, he first develops an internal attitude of animosity towards the victim. And in fact, as soon as name calling begins with a tone of animosity rather than jesting between friends, the righteousness of the command has been broken. Verse 22, whosoever shall say to his brother Raka shall be in danger of the council. What's Raka? Raka is both an Aramaic and a Hebrew word that means empty, but it actually carries the sense of you empty head. It's an insulting term. It means you're a fool or you're empty of knowledge. So when you go around calling a brother or a sister in the tone of animosity, you empty head, you dumbo, you've already broken the righteousness of the command. It is the internal animosity that could lead to the act of murder. But whether it does or doesn't lead to the act, the righteousness of this command has already been broken. Verse 23, if therefore you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave there your gift before the altar, go your way, first be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. If a person is bringing a sacrifice to the altar and he remembers that there's bitterness with somebody else, he should leave the sacrifice alone, leave it there, go and reconcile himself to the brother or to the person. So the basic idea here is that, it's better to settle things person to person rather than to wait to settle it in court. And since this statement specifically is mentions the sacrificial system here, it fits pretty well into the context of the law of Moses, but not in a church context because we don't have a sacrificial system in the church. Law of adultery, verse 27 to 30 of Matthew 5. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. In the Pharisaic interpretation, you're not guilty of violating the righteousness of this command until the act of adultery is actually committed. Again, Jesus says that's wrong. Verse 28, but I say to you that everyone that looks on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. It's true, you don't violate the letter of the command until the act is committed. You can't be stoned to death until the act is done. However, it has to do with the righteousness of the command. The righteousness is broken before the act is actually committed. Before any man commits adultery with any woman not married to him, he first develops an internal lust for her. And as soon as the lust is there internally, the righteousness of this command has already been broken. It's the internal violation that can lead to the act. But again, whether it does or does not lead to the act of adultery, the righteousness has already been broken because the intent was there. Divorce, Matthew 5, 31 to 32. And this law is found in Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. Whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. Now, there are two schools of Pharisees. One school of Pharisees, the Hillel school, interpreted, they were the very liberal ones. They interpreted the commandment to mean that you could divorce your wife for any and every reason. If she burnt the soup, that was grounds for divorce. If she put on too much weight, that was grounds for divorce. If she forgot to cook your tea, that was grounds for divorce. Something as menial as that. But according to Jesus, that's a wrong interpretation. God hates divorce. And that is the kind of righteousness that the law of divorce was perpetuating. Grounds for divorce were to be extremely limited according to Jesus. And there was only one proper ground for divorce, and that was fornication. Any other reason went beyond what the Mosaic Law allowed. And so the righteousness of the law was again violated. And Jesus's teaching was more in line with the other school of the rabbis, which was the school of Shammai. Shammai had only one reason for divorce, and that was Deuteronomy 24:1. So he was not the liberal one; he was the orthodox one. The law of oath, we see this in verses 33 to 37 of Matthew 5. Again, you have heard that it was said to them of old time, you shall not forswear yourself. Now, Mosaic Law, when talking about taking an oath, the emphasis was that your word should be sufficient, your word should be good. And we see this down in Leviticus chapter 5, verses 4 to 6, and Numbers chapter 30, verses 1 to 2. If your word was good, then even more so should keeping the oath be mandatory, because your word's good. But in the Mishnah, in the oral law, on the tractate that deals with oaths, it finds all kinds of ways you can violate the oath you've taken. An oath became open to interpretation. So you could take an oath and then you could find a loophole to get out of it. To swear by heaven or by earth or by Jerusalem or by one's own life, it's empty. Why? Because a person taking the oath, he has no control over any of these things. Pharisees had actually developed some very subtle ways in how to take an oath. If you made it one way, you had to keep it, but if you made it another way, it wasn't binding. And so they played the system. I believe it was a system that they made themselves. A believer's word should always be good enough. Oaths are not necessary. Verse 37, but let your speech be yea, yea, nay, nay, yes, yes, no, no. And whatsoever is more than these is of the evil one. So the righteousness of the law teaches that a person should develop a reputation for honesty so that his yes and his no could be taken as trustworthy. Law of non-resistance, and this is the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, Matthew 5, 38 to 42. Now, when the Mosaic Law, down in Exodus 21, 24, and corresponding passage, Matthew 5, 38, gave this eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, this was a legal punishment by a court of law, and the punishment must fit the crime. In every context, it has to do with legal justice in a court of law. However, the Pharisees took this as a basis for personal vengeance, ignoring that the righteousness of the law taught the love of neighbor. And also, according to God, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay. That's Deuteronomy 32, 35. There was no basis for personal vengeance in the law, but there were legal ways of dealing with the lawbreaker. But by using this as a basis for personal vengeance, the Pharisees violated the righteousness of the law. Rather than seeking redress in a court of civil law, it would have been more characteristic of the law's righteousness to let go and not demand one's rights. But that's not the way the Pharisees reinterpreted it. Now we have the law of love. We see this in Matthew 5, 43 to 48, Luke 6, 27 to 30, and 32 to 36. The law of love, this is concerning loving your neighbor, hating your enemy. Verse 43, you have heard that it was said, oral law, you shall love your neighbor, hate your enemy. Now, the basis for this Pharisaic teaching is found in the Psalms, where it says, do not I hate them, O Jehovah, that hate you. That's Psalm 139, verse 21. And some Pharisees defined neighbor as simply a fellow Jew. Other Pharisees did not include publicans or Sadducees under the definition of a neighbor. So as far as they were concerned, if you're a Sadducee and something goes wrong with you, you're not my neighbor. If you're a publican, oh, definitely not. And in fact, some of them went even as far as saying, if you're not another Pharisee, you're not my neighbor. So even an ordinary Jew would not be classed as a neighbor of some Pharisees. However, the righteousness of the Lord defined a neighbor as anyone who had a need that could be met. And this is what Jesus said. So true acts of love mean doing things for others, especially for those who have no means to repay. And that is your lot for tonight. There's all the contact details there. Pray God that this would have benefited you.